The rain had not been heavy, only a fine mist that made the streetlights blur into halos and left the leather of parked cars slick and reflective. The smell of wet asphalt rose in thin columns each time a pedestrian passed, and the city hummed with distant traffic like a tired animal breathing. Elena walked with her coat collar up, fingers tucked into the wool as if to persuade warmth into being. She had a small pocket radio switched off in her bag, an old habit, and the faint texture of its battered fabric against her palm reminded her of other pockets where people hid things. At 28, she worked nights folding linens in a shelter, and by day mended adverts on windows for shopkeepers. She was careful to keep her head down, and she spoke rarely because sound had always arrived late and jumbled to her ears. Her silence was not absence, it was a practice. Her hands had learned to ask questions when her voice could not. When she saw the car, it looked ordinary enough at first. Black, expensive, window fogged by heat and breath, parked under a flickering lamp by the closed bakery. The driver had left the motor idling, and the radio had been muted. Inside, a man was slumped over the steering wheel. He wore a gray suit cut as if by someone who measured power with inches. Elena paused, the soles of her shoes making a soft, precise sound on the wet pavement. A scent rose from the car, a mix of cigarette smoke and cologne, hints of lemon polish, and something floral that belonged to another life. A child would have thought him asleep. Elena thought of the many ways a body can seem to hold itself closed while a life unravels within. She knocked on the glass with 2 polite taps, learned from years of helping others where discretion mattered. The man lifted his head slowly, and when he looked at her, his face had the rawness of someone who had been crying too long. For a second, she saw a face she had only known from rumors and brief newspaper photos, Marco Rinaldi. The name carried weight in the neighborhoods where she mended posters. Marco had been a story told in corners, a shadow that took things without being seen. His eyes looked red and stunned, and he said nothing at first, only swallowed, as if trying to pull a shape into words. He mouthed, "Please," and Elena understood the movement more than the sound. She opened the door because the car smelled of panic, and because somewhere inside her a decision lived that had nothing to do with fear. Inside the vehicle, the leather seat was damp from rain and salt, and Marco held a folded paper with fingers shaking. Elena noticed the paper first, not the man. It had an imprint from a stamp and a corner with a bank logo. He looked at her with a, "Please, do not tell anyone!" He said it like an apology and like a threat at once. Elena felt the hair at the back of her neck stand up, and she reached out with a hand that trembled just enough to be human and touched his forearm with 2 soft fingers, a gesture she used when words failed both parties. That small, almost maternal touch seemed to roll through him like a wave. They spoke. He tried to explain. She looked. He begged. She signed. This small interchange grew teeth because a single envelope clutched in his hand could be an insurance policy, a confession, or a demand. Elena, who had been taught to read faces and to translate the world with her hands, read pain, not calculation. Marco spoke of a ledger someone had put where it should not be. The voice was low and hurried. He said names that were like knives. Rinaldi Import, Mayor Sarto, a date that should not have been public. Elena kept her hands visible, palms calm, and she signed slowly for the rhythm she trusted herself to keep. Her fingers made the word secret and then the word evidence. The man's face hardened and then crumpled again. Outside, a dog barked, and the sound seemed to force both of them back into the moment like tidal pressure on a strand. At 30% of this story, something shifts hard enough to ask the viewer a question. And here, at the point where Elena takes the folded paper, we pause to ask of ourselves and of the audience. Have you ever held a truth whose release might split 2 families open? If you had to choose between a safe silence and a dangerous honesty, what would you do? If you are feeling that tight mix of fear and curiosity, write down protect or reveal in the comments and tell a short sentence why. Your answer matters because choices like Elena made are rarely private. Now the narrative tightens again, and every footstep could be a drumbeat of judgment. The envelope opened like a small accusation. Inside, there were columns of figures, a page of names, and a single photograph tucked behind the paper. A smiling woman at a seaside table raising a glass, and on the edge of the photo, a small, neat signature that matched Marco Rinaldi, but also included a different surname. Elena traced the corner of the photo with her thumb. She signed a question about the woman, and Marco exhaled as if the breath had been held for years. He said, "She is not what you think," and then he stopped because explanation could make things worse. Outside the car, the bakery door opened for a moment, and a shopkeeper named Lucia, hair tied in a knot of flour and light, called for a morning delivery. Lucia waved briefly and then closed the door, and the mundane act of commerce made the scene uglier in its clarity. Life would go on while the choice waited in the damp leather of a parked car. Elena had history with silence. She had been a child in a house where conversations were currencies and where her own name was given a price. Her mother had been from a different region and spoke loudly enough to be heard across rooms of misfortune, while her father, who had been quiet by nature, had a roster of debts and promises that later became threats. At 9, Elena learned to signal at the market, a cut of meat here, a price adjusted here, a warning shape made with fingers for who was kind and who should be skirted. At 13, she had left home with a knapsack and a silence that felt like a coat. She found work in odd places, and in those kitchens and stalls she learned to read the spaces between words as much as the words themselves. At 19, a neighbor taught her the art of reading documents the way one reads a face, noticing the texture of paper, the way ink pooled, the tiny thrum of a margin note that betrayed haste. That neighbor was Antonio, now a driver who sometimes brought boxes to the shelter. In her 20s, she trained herself to sign with an economy of motion and with a tenderness that made strangers trust her. The choice to leave had been both exile and protection. The past held a ledger of its own, and the memory of a brother who vanished one winter shaped her into someone who would not ignore a trembling hand on a steering wheel. Those years taught her the essential lesson: silence could be a refuge and a prison. The present offered a third option, one she had not expected to choose. On the corner, Detective James Cole had been watching a different story altogether. He was an old acquaintance of the Rinaldi name, someone who kept files in rows and who smelt corruption like a person smells rain. He had seen Marco enter the closed circle of power years ago and had watched the rumors congeal into patterns. James stopped, adjusted his coat, and debated whether to approach. He liked order and he liked evidence. When Lucia peeked from the bakery and mouthed a question about the late delivery, James called back that he would check the license plate and waved off her curiosity. He then moved closer, the soles of his shoes producing a different rhythm on wet pavement. Elena noticed the detective, and the small sign of motion tightened into a decision. She could hand the photograph to James and let law take its clumsy, slow steps. She could fold it back into secrecy and move on with the job that paid her rent. She could give it to Marco and let him destroy what he feared. Instead, she did something small and decisive. She slid the picture into her pocket and said, quietly, "I will not be the one to make you famous for what you did." They argued in gestures and low words like neighbors singing a hymn in different keys. The exchanges multiplied into a conversation with teeth. Marco looked at her, then at the detective, then at his own hands, and said, "You do not understand." Elena signed, "You are asking me to be your shield." Marco shook his head. Eyes asked, "Please," he whispered. Detective Cole cleared his throat and asked Marco, "Are you surrendering the ledger?" Marco answered with a laugh that did not reach his eyes. Not at all. Elena watched each micro-movement, the way Marco's fingers trembled when he pressed the stamp of his corporate seal into the page. It was a sign of habit more than authority, and for a second, Elena thought of her brother and all the habitual gestures that had become last acts. The tension spooled outward. Someone in authority would notice a missing envelope. A courier, Thomas, who made morning runs for a law office, drove past and glanced at the parked car. He was later to be named as an unintentional witness. Elena called out his name, and when Thomas stopped, he said, "Did you need something?" She did not speak. She signed, "Go, please," and he nodded, uncertain. She could feel the city pressing in, the smell of coffee from the bakery, the distant hiss of brakes like the world reminding them it was busy. Each small sensory detail kept the scene tethered to reality. Elena reached deeper for a decision that was not guided by fear, but by a strange ledger she held in her chest, the balance between protection and truth. This is where the first official moment of tension arrives, a paragraph of choice and memory and cracking resolve. Marco leaned back and said, "If the ledger goes public, they will ruin Rosa." He jabbed the name like a spear. Elena's hands stilled. She signed, "Who is Rosa?" And he said, "My sister, the one who keeps our books from the public eye." He looked down, as if ashamed to reveal family in the same breath as survival. Elena remembered the brother she had lost, and the mornings after when neighbors spoke in lowered voices about disappeared men. She put her palm over the photograph in her pocket and felt the print of a smiling woman. She imagined Rosa, ledger in hand, ledger of choices that had decided who would live. The choice stretched like a rope across a canyon. Elena saw two ends, a family torn and a city that might breathe easier if truth moved like a clean wind. For a moment, she felt the gravity of being the mediator, the translator between hidden language and public record. It was a role she had not sought, but that somehow matched the shape of her life. Detective Cole suggested a middle path and said, "We can get protection, witness programs, anonymity." Marco scoffed and said, "Protection is a velvet cage." He named names and dates, and Elena counted each syllable with attention. She signed proposals with a careful economy of motion, and Marco answered with fragments of trust that might be bargains. They negotiated like people who had learned to barter with lives. Lucia closed her shop for the morning, a gesture that made the world feel more intimate, and Antonio, the driver, offered a ride for a document transfer if secrecy could be guaranteed. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled by, and the smell of bread rose like a counterclaim to the weight of the conversation. The next scene required allies, and so they formed a fragile alignment. Elena called an old friend, Marina, who wrote for a city magazine and who had a reputation for exposing corruption with precision. Marina arrived wearing a coat that smelled faintly of ink and coffee, carrying a notebook and a camera that creaked as if it could testify. Thomas, the courier, agreed to be a conduit for evidence that would not leave a trail through usual channels. Detective Cole promised a legal route that would keep some names shielded while testing others. Antonio agreed to watch over Marco if necessary. Rosa Rinaldi was invoked as someone who had kept her head down and books in order, and her name landed in Elena's heart like a bell. The shelter manager, Sophia, offered to keep Elena safe until the news settled. In this web, 7 people moved: Elena, Marco, Detective James Cole, Lucia, Antonio, Marina, Thomas, and Rosa. Each took a small action, and the combined movement began to feel like an engine. Then came the evidence that would test loyalties: an intercepted email with a phrase that read, "authorization," and a scanned receipt showing transfers to shell accounts. Marina leaned close to the screen, smelled of lemon tea and old paper, and whispered, "This is enough to start an inquiry." Elena signed the word "inquiry" and felt the word like a minor wound healing. Marco reacted like someone listening for his sentence. He said, "If this goes out, my father will not forgive me." He said it as if a final ledger lived inside the familial bones. Elena thought of fathers who had ruled households and empires with an iron silence, and of the people who became collateral. The document had a signature she could not immediately place, and a stamp from a bank branch in a district far from where Marco lived. It was evidence that belonged to more than one world. The second constructed moment of tension arrived when Detective Cole received an anonymous tip that someone had been looking into Marco the night before. The brief message was, "Watch the windows." He read it, and the room cooled. Elena felt the sting of being watched even as she stood in public light. Marco looked at the window as if expecting a shape, and then he pressed his hand to his mouth. The tip added a layer of danger that made the choices immediate. They could go public and risk retaliation, or they could move slowly and let the law make careful steps. Elena looked at each person in the temporary alliance and saw how the idea of safety differed for each one. For her, it was shelter and a new name. For Marina, it was a byline and source protection. For Detective Cole, it was a case well documented. For Marco, it was survival cloaked in family. The scene became a compass of fear. They planned a confrontation that would take place in neutral ground, a rented storage room behind an antique shop that smelled of cedar and old varnish, a place where boxes muffled sound and where cameras might be less noticed. The night before the planned meeting, Elena had a dream of a ledger spread like a map and of a man she once loved walking away with no pockets. She woke with the taste of metal in her mouth and the certainty that the next day would demand both courage and sacrifice. In that planning, they rehearsed what they would say, who would reveal which pages, and how to keep certain names from breath. The warehouse was chosen because it sat between a poor neighborhood and a business district, a liminal place that reflected Elena's own middle space between worlds. When the day for confrontation arrived, the air in the storage room had the dry, papery smell of sealed envelopes. Marco was present but not arrogant. His suit seemed to have shed a layer of weight. Rosa stood at one end, hands folded, her face composed but with a tremor in the fingers that betrayed anxiety. Detective Cole had 2 officers in the corridor as a precaution. Marina had a recorder that spun quiet circles, and Tomas held a box that contained additional documents. Elena stood near the door, as if anchoring the room with her small presence. The exchange began with formalities that felt like rituals. Marco offered a cigarette, and no one took it. He said, "We do this clean," and Detective Cole said, "No promises beyond evidence." Then the dialogue tightened into more direct lines. There were no quick speeches. Instead, there were many short exchanges that functioned like rungs up a ladder. Marco said, "I can destroy some entries." Rosa answered, "You always mean to protect us." Detective Cole asked, "Do you admit the transfers?" Marco replied, "They were a mistake in accounting." Marina said, "That is not what the emails show." Elena signed a question about motive and placed it in Marco's view, and he answered by showing anguish rather than logic. Tomas suggested a chain of custody, and all 3 men and women began to trade the small technicalities that determine whether a document is usable. For every spoken line, Elena signed. For someone who might not hear, and someone who might ignore. The exchanges grew more numerous, 8, 9, 10 times, where each reply added a new shade of probability. The room felt like a scale, slowly tipping. The climax arrived when a recording Marina had kept was played aloud. It was a voice saying authorization to transfer and a date that matched the ledger. Marco stepped back and placed both palms on his head as if holding in the collapse of a building. He said, "It is forged." He repeated the word like an incantation. Detective Cole countered with proof of call logs. Rosa wept quietly, and the sound was small and sharp in the storage room. Elena touched Rosa's hand and signed the word truth as if it could be a bomb. Marco then made a decision that surprised everyone. He took out a small envelope and pushed it across the table toward Elena. He said, "Keep it. If you want to protect us, keep it and say nothing." His voice was raw and impossible to read as purely guilt. Elena felt the weight of the paper between her fingers and knew that any choice would open fissures. This is a tension paragraph built of immediate memory and the cost of a choice. Marco looked at Elena as if waiting for a verdict that would define him. She heard the city through the walls, as if the world were a jury. In the moment, she thought of the brother whose silence had haunted her youth and of the many faces that had been traded for convenience. Elena breathed and signed, "You will not make me a co-conspirator." Marco whispered, "Then do not show them the photograph." Elena folded it into her palm and slid it into a pocket where it would sit hot and dangerous. She understood then that revealing could break families, but also unbind the city from the pressure of an oligarchy. The decision was a blade that cut both ways. After the confrontation, consequences moved like dominoes. The documents were handed to a legal team with anonymity agreements. Marina published a careful piece that named facts but shielded identities. Detective Cole opened a restrained inquiry that focused on bank protocol and third-party accounts. Rosa stepped back from the company and announced leave to tend to her health, a public face that softened the shock. Marco disappeared for days and then resurfaced with a statement about family hardship and a vow to cooperate with investigations. The community reacted with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Some called Elena courageous and called her by name. Others whispered that she had been naive to think a single envelope could shift power structures. In the immediate aftermath, there were raids and subpoenas, and the city's press began to stitch the story into a larger pattern. 1 month later, Elena found that the shelter where she worked had new faces. People arrived with questions about witness programs and about whether a life of silence could become a life of speaking. She had a small interview with a social worker who asked about her role and whether she felt safe. Elena signed slowly across the table and said she felt lighter and heavier at once. The photograph in her pocket had been copied under strict chain of custody. The original had been entered into evidence. The Rinaldi business watched its stock wobble, and a board meeting had convened that was described in dry press as a routine restructuring. Elena started teaching sign language classes in the community center once a week, a way to make the silence she had practiced into an instrument for others. The hands that once guarded memories now built bridges. She took walks at dawn, and the city seemed slightly clearer, the air a fraction less dense with unspoken debts. 3 months later, the inquiry had grown teeth. Subpoenas had reached offshore accounts, and a few middle managers were arrested. Marina had published a follow-up that included snippets of transcripts with names redacted. Detective Cole paused in his office and told Elena that the case was not over, but it was moving. Marco had been seen at a courthouse, escorted, and not made the spectacle the tabloids had predicted. Rosa had quietly filed for protection and named a lawyer who would work for reduced fees as an act of community restitution. Elena's classes had become a small hub where neighbors met and swapped stories. The shelter received a modest grant that allowed Elena to hire an assistant, Sophia, who managed donations and who had a laugh that sounded like a bell. The media cycle slowed, and the city began to argue about structural change rather than personal scandals, which was progress, even if incomplete. 6 months later, the landscape had been altered in measurable ways. A short audit had forced some executives to resign, and a small reform bill concerning corporate transparency in municipal contracting passed in a preliminary vote. Elena had been asked to testify as a protected witness, and she agreed to give a recorded statement. She did so with Marina in the room and Detective Cole present, her hands steady as she translated through a court interpreter the signs she had always used. The shelter opened a new wing for legal aid, and the class Elena taught expanded into a program to train community translators who could support others in legal settings. Marco Rinaldi remained a complicated figure in the public imagination. Some called for harsh punishment, and others spoke of a man who had finally shown remorse. Rosa kept her distance and later became a patron of the legal aid wing, donating funds with names redacted. Elena learned that consequence can be both public and private, and that repair is work that takes months, maybe years. She kept the photograph in a locked box at the shelter, and sometimes, when the afternoons were quiet, she would touch its corner and remember the day rain made a halo, and a man cried in his car. In the end, what changed was not a singular redemption, but a loosening of cords. Elena had walked into a storm and chosen a shape for herself that was neither silence nor spectacle, but a third path where translation could be protection and exposure could be a tool for justice. The neighborhood slowly adapted. People who once crossed the street to avoid Rinaldi import now spoke across it in a different manner. The small acts multiplied. A subsidy for community legal aid, a volunteer list for translation services, and an informal council that met in the old bakery to discuss municipal oversight. Elena continued to mend adverts and fold linens, and at night she sometimes sat by a window and signed letters to a niece who had moved away. The city breathed differently, as if a held breath had been released. If you felt moved by Elena's choice, share in the comments whether you would have protected a secret or told the truth and why. Stories like this survive when people speak and when they listen.